Okay, well, I'd like to thank Harold for the opportunity to come over and speak at this meeting. So I had a nice quiet ride over here. Get to talk about the Dicamba topic again, and I don't know how many times I've talked about Dicamba this winter, but I know I've got 6 more after today because I'm counting them down. But nonetheless, I think it's been a really good opportunity for us not only to really kind of get ahead of a technology in terms of trying to steward something different than what we did with Roundup Ready 2, but also it's been a great opportunity for us to explain the importance of the herbicide label to Indiana farmers as well. So today I've got a slightly different title than what Harold had in the program, and the reason I've got a slightly different title is I was putting a presentation together to give a seminar on campus, and I thought, you know, the things that I want to talk about in this seminar are the exact same things I want to talk about in this presentation right here. And it's really less of going through the nitty-gritty parts of the label and really kind of explaining why we have Dicamba, why it's important, some of the challenges we've been through, and then kind of my view on what we need to do moving forward. So I kind of put this thing up here, and I was joking with John Obermeyer earlier this morning, is that this is almost as important to us as soybean rust was to a pathologist or aphids were to an entomologist. It kind of gives us a reason for living. All right, now I'll keep a close eye on the time. I think I got a clock right here, but if you guys have got a question, feel free to answer it. I don't care whether or not I get through all of my slides. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is important to American agriculture. What previous knowledge did we have when this technology came onto the market? We knew an awful lot, okay, but we brought it to market anyway. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of some insight of what we did in the state of Indiana. You know, how the whole problem transpired and what we did to respond to it. And then one of the things I like to joke about, some people say that our grand challenge in agriculture is feeding 9 billion people. Well, right now, this Dicamba topic, when you look at the amount of time I spend on it, this is my grand challenge right here. All right, so again, these are the topics I'm going to talk about. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the need of the technology. Now, the great thing about Ohio is I think you guys have got the same basic weed issues that we have in Indiana. We have some broadleaf weeds. Oh, there we go. We have some broadleaf weeds in Indiana that we simply can't control, and so that really kind of highlights the need for it. So again, one of the things I like to remind my audience is, you know, you really had to be living in a cave this past summer not to understand what was going on in terms of agronomic crop production and soybean production and Dicamba spraying. You know, when you have headlines that are making the Bloomberg and the New York Times, and then a lot of the things making the Indianapolis news, you know you have a situation where something important is going on out there and there's people paying attention. So again, the big reason for this is the fact that we have these resistant weeds. And in Indiana, our driver weeds in soybean are mare's tail, giant ragweed, water hemp, and to a smaller degree, palmer. The palmer issue, even though we found it in a lot of counties, it's turned out that it's not as big of an issue as water hemp is right now. Water hemp is more widespread. We have bigger issues with controlling that. Palmer tends to be a problem, a worse problem when we have hot, dry years, droughty conditions. And then when we have our wet years, we tend to have more problems with water hemp. And our springs tend to be more wet than they are dry. And again, ragweed, giant ragweed, that's been around forever. The problem hasn't blown up nearly as quickly in giant ragweed as it has in mare's tail and water hemp, but certainly that's a weed we're still dealing with. Now, we have, yeah, Jeff.
So what's your reasoning for the east central side of Indiana having so much water hemp? Because it's leading over into west central Ohio, so I'm trying to get you why that's there.
Okay, so yeah, Jeff's question is, why do we have so much water hemp on the eastern side of Indiana? So if we go back to 2002, 3, and 4, when I did the big survey, we had about 4 pockets of water hemp. So one pocket was kind of up here where we have really bad palmer. This western tier of counties right here, a little bit in the Seymour area, and right in here. Those were the 4 original pockets of water hemp. So why it was here before I got here, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's just because of the soil types. It tends to like soils that have a lot of clay in them, that don't drain very well. It also tends to be in areas where you have more continuous soybeans. So I don't know I haven't looked at this. Like I know when we get down into here, we have about a 2-to-1 ratio of beans to soybeans. So that means we have more beans on beans. In this part of the state, I don't recall what our USDA acreage estimates look like, but the only thing I can think of is it could be because of the clay soils, because I'm not sure about the crop rotation. But good point. Okay, so again, you can kind of see where our pockets are. I guess on the PPO resistance, this is one here that, this one was kind of scary because 2 years ago, we had 4 counties down in this part of the state where we had identified PPO resistant water hemp, and now we're up to about 20 counties or so. So we were essentially doubling the number of counties every year. Now, I don't expect that number to continue to double because I see so much migration away from using straight Roundup Ready 2s. You know, we're going to be using the Enlist, we're going to be using Liberty Link. We'll have about 10,000 acres, or I'm sorry, we're going to be using Extend, Liberty Link, and we'll have about 10,000 acres of Enlist soybeans. So we may not get many samples sent in from this, but nonetheless, just the rapidity of the growth was very eye-opening for that one. Okay, so again, this is the driver, this is the problem, this is why we're moving away from Roundup Ready 2s. Now, so single herbicide resistance in and of itself, you know, can drive some minor management changes. What is really starting to eat our lunch is what we call multiple resistance. So when you have weeds that are resistant to more than one herbicide, so here we have weeds that are resistant to ALSs and glyphosate, and giant ragweed, water hemp, mare's tail, and palmer easily fit that category in the state of Indiana. We have some weeds that are resistant to 3 modes of action, water hemp and palmer amaranth. And if you go into some of the states to the west of Indiana, you'll find water hemp that's resistant to 4, 5, I think there's one that's even resistant to 6 modes of action now as well. So I know you guys have got very similar weed issues. I know Jeff's done a wonderful job of documenting that over the years, Jeff and Mark. And so, again, these are the things that drive management decisions because in many places in Indiana where we have water hemp and mare's tail, we have no post-emerge tools for controlling those weeds in Roundup Ready 2. Yet we'll still have some guys that'll try to get another year out of Roundup. Okay, so that's kind of the scary thing. So this is a slide that I use with my farmers. I kind of use round numbers. Mare's tail was kind of a cheap warning shot over the bow. Unfortunately, we didn't gather enough attention with that one and make the appropriate management changes. But that one wasn't going to cost us very much. Giant ragweed, a little bit more. A few fewer tools that we can use for giant ragweed. When we get into water hemp and palmer, that's $50 an acre. These are game changers right here. These weeds were $50 an acre before the chemicals were generic. Now that the chemicals are generic, it's still a $50 an acre weed. In my view, we don't have anything new coming to market that offers us a lot of hope. I would be surprised in my lifetime if I see another Roundup, another herbicide that costs $10 an acre and controls 2 dozen weeds. I just don't see that happening, okay? And I know Ohio is very similar to Indiana. We do not want to go back to our intensive tillage programs. Our farm sizes have gotten big. We like saving soil. We like the cost share associated with some of these conservation programs. That's not going to be one of the first things we do, even though that's one of the best things that we can do for mare's tail. It's one of the cheapest and best things we can do for mare's tail. Cover crops. So I usually get myself in trouble anytime I mention anything about cover crops. I like cover crops for mare's tail. Okay? I think cereal rye in particular can do a good job of suppressing mare's tail. With the other cover crops and summer annual weeds, the results are kind of erratic. You really need to get biomass, but in order to get biomass, you're going to keep the soil wet. You're going to interfere with the residual herbicide. So there's kind of a sweet spot in there that you got to hit when you use cover crops for summer annual weeds, and we haven't figured it out yet. So again, what I see happening is we're going to migrate to the best short-term solutions. Liberty Link, Extend, and Enlist. We had pockets in the state where palmer was really bad, where we had as much as 25 to 40% Liberty Link last year. Okay? When I was doing my winter meetings last year, a year ago December of 16, we were projected to be somewhere between 30 to 50% Liberty Link across the entire state. Then the Extend approvals came through and a lot of guys switched their Liberty Link over to Extend. So this year we're probably going to be about 50% Extend beans, about 25% Liberty Link, 10,000 acres of Enlist, and the rest of them will be Roundup Ready 2s. I know Cargill is offering $1.50 a bushel for non-GMOs. I got some guys that want to grow non-GMOs. Unfortunately, they want to try to do it on a water hemp acre, so I need to try to talk them off the building on that one. But nonetheless, you know, we do see this rapid migration away from Roundup Ready 2s, which is much more rapid than I would have ever anticipated it would be. So I don't know where you guys are here in Ohio, but we're probably looking at 25% or less Roundup Ready 2s in the state. Okay, now, so again, what's the big train coming down the track is Extend. A lot of grower interest in it. You have a very powerful seed machine with a very good reputation for surviving our eastern climates. And if we start looking at some of the weed control data, this is some work we did dating back to 2007, but it's a slide that tells a really good story as far as why we like these growth regulator herbicides, and kind of a realistic picture of what they do. So here's an experiment here where we had both 2,4-D and Dicamba. It was at a site that had glyphosate-resistant mare's tail, so you can see that even the 840-gram rate of glyphosate was only giving us about 20% control. We put 2,4-D in there. This would be the pint rate, and we get it up to about 80%. If we go with the quart rate, we can get it up to about 90%. And Banville, kind of a similar thing. As we get the rate up there, we can get some decent control. So again, we can go from 20 up to about 85 or 90, but we're not going from 20 up to 100. So it's not a silver bullet, but it's definitely better than what we can do. So that's mare's tail. This would be water hemp, and this water hemp, we didn't call this one glyphosate resistant. It certainly was ALS resistant, but glyphosate doesn't work all that well on it by itself. But again, what you can see with 2,4-D, it's a little bit rate dependent. When the rates are down there at a pint or a pint and a half, you're somewhere between about 80 and 90, and you're really not consistently above 90 until you get to that 1 quart rate. So again, it's not a silver bullet. It's better than what you're getting with glyphosate alone, but kind of a similar story with Dicamba as well. You need to have the higher rates out there. So we're not going to be able to skimp on rates with these technologies on these two weeds and have them be successful. Okay, now ragweed, whole different story. We will, with 2,4-D and Dicamba, we will arguably have the best post-emerge herbicides for giant ragweed in beans that we have ever had. Okay, wonderful tool for giant ragweed, even reduced rates. And so again, with the pint rate, we can get almost 100% control. Even very low rates of Banville, we can get over 90% control. So very good tool there, but again, a little bit of a challenge on those other ones. It's going to be a little bit more of a moving needle on the other ones. Okay, one of the things that we did then this past year is our Soybean Alliance, the Indiana Soybean Association, came to us and said, you know, they've been supporting our herbicide-resistant weed screening effort now for over 10 years. They recognize the fact that we have all these new traits coming onto the market, so they wanted us to do some more demonstrations, not necessarily research plots, but demonstration plots. So we put out Extend, Enlist, Bleacher Bean, and Liberty Link demos at 4 of our pack farms where we have relatively large field days. So this is a site here where we have ALS, glyphosate, and PPO-resistant water hemp, and then here's what an Extend-based program looks like. Now, the unfortunate thing is a lot of times I see our growers walking away from this and say, well, all I got to do is add Dicamba and it looks like this. The reality of the matter is this has Valor in it pre-emerge, it has some Warrant in it post-emergence, and it's an integrated program. It's not adding Dicamba to glyphosate. It's part of an integrated program to make that plot look like that. So as we get this message out to our clientele, we've got to remember that it's part of an integrated program. It's not going to be just adding Dicamba to it. And my own personal feeling is if we go down this pathway of just adding Dicamba to glyphosate, 2 things are going to happen. All right. Number one, we're going to be doing a lot of resprays, right? Because what happens when we don't control weeds the first time? What do? We respray it, right? What are we going to respray it with? More Dicamba. So you're putting selection pressure out there for resistance, number one. But number two, we've also shown that we get a lot more volatility off of plant tissue than we do off soil. So if we're spraying these weedy grown-up messes and not getting a lot of dicamba down to the dirt, we're going to have more volatility. More volatility means what? Moves off-site, we get to see this stuff on TV, right? So and that's not where we want to be in agriculture. So really what we need to do is build this integrated program, not rely on spraying dicamba repeatedly post-emergence, because that's just going to lead to headaches. It's going to lead to resistance and more off-site movement issues. So as I mentioned earlier, we're projected to go from about 25% in 17 to 50% in 2018 in the state of Indiana. Okay, and I know we have some townships that are going to be 100% just because they had a lot of off-site movement and they're trying to protect themselves from off-site movement. Okay, so I want to give you a little snapshot now from a regulatory standpoint, what happened in Indiana this past year. All right, so when the off-site movement issues began occurring in the Mid-South region, and their crop was about 3 to 4 weeks ahead of ours, and nothing was happening in the Midwest, I was pretty smug, and I thought, well, we've got better applicators up here. You know, we're not using generic dicamba. It's not going to happen to us. Well, about 3 weeks after that, I kind of had my bubble burst. And the drift complaints started flowing in, not only in Indiana, but other surrounding states. So EPA had kind of had their pump primed on this, and they were sort of ready to react. So they organized these weekly conference calls where people like myself and Mark Laux and other extension weed scientists would call into these conference calls and kind of give an update of what was happening in our state. We also had our state regulatory agencies involved in these as well. So Kevin Bradley assembled this map, and these are the total number of drift complaints that were turned in to state regulatory agencies during the summertime in 2017. So it looks like you guys looks like you guys had 28 drift complaints turned in. So you guys were one of the low ones. You must have better applicators here than what we have. We had 128, Illinois 245, Missouri almost 1,000, Minnesota 250, Arkansas almost 1,000, Missouri 300. But basically you can see that if we add all these up across the U.S., we were 2,700 drift complaints turned in just for off-site movement of dicamba. Now, if we take a closer look at the Indiana data, normally, or I shouldn't say normally, but from 13 to 16, we would have somewhere between 74 and 90 drift complaints turned in every year. And that's everything. That's dicamba in everything. We went from an average of about 90, or 85 to 90, up to 257. Okay, so it was a bad year for drift, even without dicamba. But just with dicamba, we were at 129, and the previous 4 years were somewhere between 3 and 8. And so I can't even do the math as far as the percentage of increase of drift complaints when you go from an average of about 6 up to 129. So again, it's 50% of our drift complaints. When your numbers go from single digits up to triple digits, that gets the attention of regulatory agencies. And as a consumer, that's what I want that regulatory agency to do. I want them to see those numbers and go, oh crap, we got a problem. We need to do something here. So you can't fault the regulatory agency for making reactions. All right, so again, let's talk a little bit more about the symptomology. But there's a number of different ways that this can occur. All these auxin herbicides can move a number of different ways. Drift, volatility, dust, water, spray tank contamination. There's also some diseases that can cause this symptomology as well, but this isn't a pathology talk, so I'm not giving those guys any love with this one. We're going to talk about the herbicide injury part of this. Now, one of the areas where academics like myself have gotten crossways with industry is we disagree on the contribution of volatility to off-site movement. As an academic, we see the cases out there and we say, well, that's not spray tank contamination, that's not drift. There's a pretty good chance there's some volatility. And what industry does is industry refuses to acknowledge that volatility is as much of a contributor as what we think it is. So we're late in being able to do some of these volatility studies with the new formulations, but sometime in the next couple years, the science is going to bring us together and we're going to come to agreement on it. So what I want to do is kind of discuss volatility a little bit, just to kind of make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. I turned it off. I think I'm good to go here. Okay, so every organic molecule So whether it's sucrose, whether it's a herbicide, whether it's a skin cell, whatever it happens to be, anything with carbon in it is going to have what's called a vapor pressure. Vapor pressure means the tendency to convert from a liquid to a gas, okay? So if we take a look at some of the commonly known herbicides, here's atrazine, 2,4-D, dicamba, command, for those of you that are old enough to remember that. For those of you that are even older, you might remember Sutan. I remember Sutan, all right? God bless us all. All right, so what I've done is I've converted all of these numbers so they're consistent here in terms of 10 to the negative 7th, but what you want to do is look at these numbers. So atrazine is a 2.9, 2,4-D and dicamba are an order of magnitude or at least 10 times more volatile. Command is over 1,000 times more volatile than atrazine, and Sutan 13,000 times more volatile. All right, so anybody remember Sutan? How did we apply and use Sutan? We worked it in. Very good. Why? Yeah, twice. 2 directions, right? Remember how that label read? We had to work it in twice because it was volatile and you would lose it, okay? Who remembers the 1980s? Yeah, I was in college. I remember a few things in the early 1980s. So Command, when Command came onto the market, turned everything white, right? But Command, why was Command such a popular herbicide? It worked on foxtail and what else? Velvet leaf. Man, it was wonderful. But man, it turned things white. And so eventually the label changed with Command to where we had to do a light incorporation. Okay, you guys remember that? All right, so again, we're dealing with a couple of herbicides here that are not nearly as volatile as some older stuff. But we have vegetation out there, particularly soybeans, that are not dicamba tolerant, that are really sensitive. You also have oak trees, redbud trees, cypress trees, tomatoes, specialty crops, and a lot of things that are really sensitive. So, key thing to keep in mind with volatility is as your temperatures are warmer, volatility increases because there's actually a function called Henry's Law. How many of you know what Henry's Law is? Good. I had to take PChem, and that Henry's Law just about sorted me out of PChem. All right, so it's a big, long equation that basically says as temperature increases, volatility increases. Okay? All right, so one of the things I want to talk about is volatility research. So I'm not going to bore you with a whole bunch of data and slides on how this is done, but basically there was a lot of volatility work that was done with older formulations of dicamba and 2,4-D. It clearly showed that they were both volatile, they could both move long distances, it could move for up to a couple of days, the older formulations. With the newer formulations, the manufacturers did not allow academics to do volatility research. Okay, they would take us out to their farms and let us see their demonstrations and show us that it was less volatile, and we believed them. But what came across in the marketing message then was the fact that volatility was zero. And the fact that volatility is not zero. So let me show you how this is done, because basically we are in a catch-up mode now as far as doing volatility research with new formulations. So there's a number of different universities that are doing these. So one way that you do this is you put these air samplers in the field. Okay, these air samplers basically suck air through them. The dicamba is caught on a resin. You take that resin into the lab, wash it off the resin, run it through a piece of analytical equipment, and then you can determine whether or not it's dicamba. So again, this is a pretty good technique, but one of the challenges you run into is getting this equipment set up and making sure your wind is going in the right direction. And then you have to get a certain mass of wind that goes by these samplers here in order to get enough dicamba on the resins in order to be able to pick it up with your analytical equipment. So that's one way of doing it. This tends to be kind of expensive. Another way to do it, and this is, again, from the standpoint of being in the field, this is real life in the field, so this kind of tells you what's happening under field conditions. Okay. Now another way to do it is to do these things that we call them vapor chambers, or basically fish tanks that are sealed up. You put sensitive plants in there, and then you could put plants in there that have been treated as well. So you have some that are treated, some that are not treated. You pull air through there, okay, and then you pull the air through a resin, and you can extract the resin for the dicamba, and you can also look at the plants that were sensitive to see if any symptomology showed up. But the beauty with these is you can adjust things like temperature. You can see if you get more volatility with some temperatures than you do with other temperatures, and you can kind of track how many hours the dicamba came off the plants. Oh, you can also put soil in these things as well, and you can look at volatility from soil versus plant tissue. All right, another way to do it is what's called tunnels. So basically what you do is you plant sensitive crops inside, you plant sensitive crops, you put these tunnels up over them, and you take these flats and you treat them somewhere else, so you're not spraying them right in the plot, and then you bring these flats into these low tunnels, and then basically what this does is it forces air through these tunnels, and so it concentrates the dicamba on the sensitive tissue here. So what you can do then is you can measure how far in either direction the dicamba goes based on what happens with these plants here. So these are called low tunnels. And then another way of doing it, this is an experiment we did up near Wabash, Indiana, so a little bit west of Fort Wayne. We treated 3-acre blocks out in the field, out in a field of sensitive soybeans. We tracked the wind direction, and then you can go out there with GPS units and you can actually walk the boundary of where you see symptomology with the GPS unit. And so you can draw a drift plume with the GPS unit. So again, this is kind of cool too because you can look at how far it moved, you can look at what direction it moved. The challenge with something like this is when you have winds that kind of shift directions every 12 hours, what does that really mean? The other thing that you can do is you can set indicator plants out here at various intervals and you can measure how far it goes at different times after application as well by putting fresh plants out there in pots. So kind of 4 different ways you can do these volatility studies, and so I'm not going to show you a whole bunch of data, but what we learned so far is that the new formulations, just like the manufacturer said, the new formulations are less volatile, no question whatsoever, but they're not non-volatile. You do get some movement, whether that's on dust particles or as a gas. Some of that we're still trying to sort some of that out, but you do get movement. You get more volatility from plant surfaces than you do from soil, so that suggests to me that soil particle movement or dust movement doesn't completely explain it. All right? And then you can get off-site movement for up to 3 days after application. So those are kind of the significant results. But like I mentioned earlier, because we could not test those new formulations until recently, we're in a catch-up mode on this volatility work. And so, again, hopefully at some point we get industry and academics to agree on that. But right now we're kind of at different ends of the spectrum. Okay, so again, as I mentioned earlier, we've known early on that we do get off-site movement via volatility. I wanted to go through some of the papers that were done on this whole issue of injury and how much yield penalty it causes. So this is some work done in Illinois, published in '69. So the work was done in the mid-1960s. And so again, you can look at the impact here. 2,4-D up to 2 ounces per acre had little effect on yield. Soybean was dicamba was more injurious. So this is kind of the first report that said dicamba was more injurious to soybean than 2,4-D was. And soybean was more sensitive to applications during flowering than before flowering. Okay, and that really means in terms of yield loss. Another paper done in South Dakota in '78, again, kind of said the same thing about application timing, that varieties differed just a little bit, and that you could have some reduction of seed viability if exposure was made at pod fill. So you really wanted to avoid the late season exposures. This is the volatility paper I talked about earlier. So less volatile formulations reduced but did not eliminate volatility. And when you killed the terminal buds, typically that's when you got yield reduction. So this paper indicated that the soybeans could be beat up pretty severely early in the year, but as long as you didn't kill the terminal bud and you got the rain late in the year, yield was going to be okay. Another one, this was actually some Ohio data here, if I remember right, so you guys may remember this person. Again, basically showed that the soybeans can vary a little bit in their response. So in 1980, it took 0.04 ounces to get a 10% yield reduction. In 81, it took about 10 times that much. So soybeans are going to vary just a little bit in how they respond, and I assume some of that is due to weather. And then this work was done in Kansas, so kind of said some of the same thing. I'm not going to read all that stuff to you. This one here, one of their major conclusions is that early season injury ratings were not reliable predictors of yield loss. And again, because soybeans can do a fairly good job of recovering. Now, if you hire a really good graduate student, though, the next work I'll show you is if you hire a really good graduate student to do those injury ratings, they can get themselves calibrated pretty well. So I think that might have been a difference in students. All right, so about 7 or 8 years ago, I recruited this graduate student. He actually did a master's degree with Sean Conley, and he came on with me to do a PhD, but he was just super interested in soybeans and soybean agronomy and stuff like that, and wanted to do a project that had soybeans in it. So I said, have I got a deal for you? I said, I see this new technology, Extend and Enlist, coming onto the market. I know we're going to move this stuff around a little bit because we're not going to be 100% adoption. And so let's do some projects to try to figure out how injurious these products can be on some of our newer genetics. So basically, we set up these plots, exposed soybeans at one of 3 different times. Let's see, it was V2, V5, and R2, and then took a whole bunch of pictures, and this poor student was out there rating plots on a daily basis. So again, this is kind of what some of the information that he collected and organized. And I'm not going to go through a lot of data here, but basically you generate a lot of graphs that look like this, and you can look at the influence of dicamba rate on plant height based on exposure time. You can look at injury over time. You can look at the number of reproductive nodes, and here you see what's called a hormetic response. When you expose soybeans to low rates, you can get more reproductive nodes. Now that doesn't mean anything in terms of yield, but you can get more nodes. And then again, here's our yield data right here. So again, you can get more reproductive nodes, but it really doesn't have an impact on yield. So you can generate stuff like this as well, but basically the take-home message from this was that when you expose beans to about 2 grams per hectare, and 2 grams over a hectare is not very much, you can see reduced numbers of seeds per pod, reduced number of nodes, and basically you can see, well, not much of an impact here, but you can reduce the seed number and the number of reproductive nodes. All right, so here's the papers then that we published on that work. So again, you can go back to those if you want to read those in more detail. But again, the moral of the story is that we could see injury potential with both 2,4-D and dicamba. It doesn't take a lot to cause symptomology. You can get more reproductive nodes, but it still drives me nuts when I hear people say, well, you dinged them up a little bit and increased yield. And trust me, I'm not the first person to look at that factor. If we could actually add dicamba to a spray tank and increase yield, we would be doing it. And I'm not aware that anybody's doing that commercially on purpose. Okay? So that statement kind of bothers me, so I want to make sure that we set the record straight with the real life data on that just simply doesn't happen. Okay, so I want to go back now to, we've talked a little bit about why we need it. We've talked about how widespread the drift damage was in Indiana. We talked about some of the previous research. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about how people are getting themselves into trouble with label violations. So we're going to tease apart some of these dicamba data and basically kind of show you what happened with that. So I don't know if you guys have the opportunity to see this kind of data from your state regulatory agency or not, but I think our guys in Indiana like seeing this kind of stuff because it sort of lets them know what are easy things to do to either break the label or not break the label, just in terms of keeping themselves out of trouble. Okay, so right now, it takes a long time to complete these dicamba investigations. So of the 129 cases, 87 of them have been completed. So in terms of our applicators, about a quarter of them are commercial, 63% were private, and 13% were non-certified. So in 2017, we didn't have the new dicamba rules in place, and you didn't have to be certified to apply it as long as you worked for somebody that was certified. So the way the rules are in Indiana is if you work for somebody that's certified, you're covered. Now that rule is different for 2018, but that's how it was in 2017. In terms of the products involved, it probably reflects sales volumes. So what the people tell me in Indiana anyway is that we probably sold a little more Ingenia than we did Extendamax, and Fexapan probably was not moved nearly as much. So I wouldn't read too much into that one other than they all move. In terms of what what the intended target was in terms of what it was applied to. You know, again, this is why we're having this discussion in a soybean session, is that 92% of these 87 drift cases were from post-emerge treatments to soybean. Only 6% to corn, okay? So our corn count is probably going to be similar to that 3 to 8 cases like we've had in the past. All right, 2% were a rights away. So again, these are the products applied. In terms of what was injured, 93% of the cases were non-DT soybeans, 1% some other sites, one person claimed he was sprayed. I'm not sure how he knew that. I don't know whether his ears cupped up or what happened there. But anyway, so post-emerge treatments to soybeans, moving off-site and injuring non-target soybeans is the headache that we're dealing with. In terms of the route of off-target exposure, so this is the category here that is driving our state chemists nuts. All right, a quarter of them they could tell were particle drift. 74% of them they can't really tell where it's coming from. And here's why. We have 8 inspectors that cover the state of Indiana. They each have a geography. So if you take 92 counties divided by 8, they have 11 or 12 counties per inspector. So they deal with drift, but they also deal with all of the other issues that our State Department of Ag has to investigate. So usually it takes about 3 weeks for the symptoms to show up. Okay? Then it's usually about another 2 weeks before that inspector can get to the field. So by the time that 5 weeks have elapsed, a lot of times other fields have been sprayed, number one. Number two, Dicamba is metabolized in sensitive plants very rapidly. And so when they get out there to collect plant tissue and take it back to the lab and analyze it, rarely can they find Dicamba. So that means they can't pick up patterns. They can't pick up drift patterns where they have high concentrations on one side of the field and low concentrations on the other. So when something like that happens and you can't really rule out tank contamination, runoff, or something else, they lump it into this undeterminable category. And what that means, it's probably a combination of one or more of what happened above. So again, I think one of the reasons why we're having some of these issues with the additional regulations is the fact that in many cases, we can't tell where this stuff is coming from, and there's relatively large areas that are affected what appear to be uniformly. Okay? So again, that's what we know so far. Again, if we tease these apart, in 82 out of the 87 cases, we had some kind of a label violation. The most common label violation was not visiting a website. So did you guys know a product would move off-site if you didn't visit a website? How many knew that? No, that's not why it moved off-site, but that's just to let you know that that's one of the things that inspectors look for. Did you look at that website? So again, you need to visit the website. There's 2 websites. There's the website for the registrant, and there's also DriftWatch, that your record-keeping form has dates on there for when you visited it, and you have to do this within 7 days of your application. Okay? So what our state chemists will tell you is that if this is your only label violation, you're not getting a fine. Okay? You're going to get a letter of reprimand. Please look at the website. You need to know where sensitive crops are. You need to make sure you got the right nozzles, that you haven't put stuff in the tank that's not approved, but that's not going to get you a fine. The second most common one was wind blowing toward adjacent sensitive crops. So that one's a little bit more troubling to me because it indicates that we either have a bunch of cowboys out there spraying and they don't care what's next to them, or they're vindictive. So this one here, in my mind, I think this one here, if we could take this number down significantly, my guess is that we can reduce the number of drift complaints that turns in. This seems like low-hanging fruit to me. If you have an adjacent sensitive crop, do not spray until the wind is blowing in a different direction. Okay, that seems like an easy one. This one here is going to be a little bit tougher. What we have seen, and with the label being tightened up now to restrict your applications between 3 and 10, that is a pretty tight window to fit into. That is a really tight window to fit into. We've looked at some of our weather data in more detail, and anytime you have wind speeds that are 8 mile an hour, you're almost always going to have gusts that are greater than 10 mile an hour. So even if your wind speeds are saying consistently 8 mile an hour, you're most likely you're going to be in violation of the label because the gusts are going to be, they're going to exceed 10 mile an hour. All right, so again, two big areas here that I think offer some room for improvement, and these here, if they're checked repeatedly for an individual applicator, that's going to get you a fine. Okay, now, as you guys well know, every state has to do some sort of mandatory training now. We need to try to do a better job of stewarding the product. Again, what I tell people is that it's unlikely that EPA is going to make a quick decision on what happens with these products, but I think individual states will be pretty quick to pull the trigger on more restrictions. And we've already seen this in a state like Arkansas. Arkansas has already banned it, okay? So the wheels are already moving down that pathway with at least one state. Minnesota, South Dakota, Missouri, Tennessee all have either calendar date or high temperature cutoffs. So we don't have anything like that in Indiana. I'm pretty sure you guys don't have anything like that in Ohio. But again, those things are already in place in other states. So think about what would happen if you couldn't apply dicamba if your air temps were over 80 degrees. So anybody in here from Cincinnati area, you know, you guys are going to hit 80 degrees a lot earlier in the year than what we are up here north. But again, that could be a pretty big deal. So again, how did Indiana respond to this? So got about 8 or 10 minutes here. So again, our state chemist was very engaged from day one. They were talking to us. They were talking to other state regulatory agencies. They were doing background work to think about, okay, what kind of policies could we put in place for 2018? And they started vetting those with various groups. Groups like us, groups like the custom applicators. They put together a website where they were basically collecting as much information as possible. We have Indiana Pesticide Review Board meetings every couple of months. Those are open meetings. We always had representatives from Monsanto, BASF, DuPont. We had the industry groups represented there, farmer groups as well. So again, what we were doing in extension is we were answering the phone, answering text messages. I don't know how many times my computer got locked up with images that I'd have to clean out of there, assisting our plant diagnostic lab, and then beginning our planning process for our winter training sessions because we knew we had to do something different. So the weed scientists kind of do what weed scientists do, kind of talk to people, help them find answers to what they're doing. And we were spending a lot of time talking to media as well. A lot of the magazines and newspapers and stuff like that were contacting us because they wanted somebody to comment on it. So how did they respond? So that goes back to 17. In terms of 18, our board recommended that all agricultural dicamba become restricted use, and the reason for that is they wanted to track the bad actors. And so if you have a dicamba injury situation and you bought a whole bunch of generic dicamba, they want to be able to get you. All right? We don't think we have a lot of that going on, but we certainly don't want to have any of it. EPA required every state to do mandatory dicamba training. Our board decided that this was going to be done by extension, the state chemist, or just a select few other individuals. We decided, you know, the comment from our state chemist was we allowed industry training for the 2017 season, and it was not effective enough. And so we're going to try something different. Now, what we're doing may be a complete failure as well, but at least we'll have a data point to kind of compare to. Our training may not be any better than industry training if we have just as many drift complaints. All right, so what have we done? We put together training materials. We had 2 webinars in the fall to run these training materials past our educators because some of our educators were going to be doing the meetings. We developed some written training materials, record-keeping forms, cartoons on some of the most important label guidelines, and then some additional information regarding the volatility situation. To date, we've done over 120 county-based training programs. Normally, during the course of a year, the state of Indiana does about 200 pesticide meetings over the course of an entire year. We did 120 meetings just in the month of January. So again, we're hitting this stuff pretty hard. We're not done yet. We do have a couple more weeks going on. And we have things like our bigger workshops that we do as well. We train people at those. And we've got a couple of webinars planned for late March in order to try to catch people that have missed one of the earlier training training opportunities. Okay, here's the infographic or the cartoon that we developed. So like many people, you get tired of reading really technical label language, so we created this cartoon to kind of outline the most important things on that label. That's passed out at every one of these county meetings. We also wrote this publication here, so Mark and I and Aaron Hager worked together on this one. So this kind of adds a little bit of verbiage to the cartoon that we wrote. We also talk about the volatility component in this one as well. So if you're really concerned about off-site movement via volatility, there's some information in here as well. And then we created these scenarios where we kind of go through what a day looks like in the life of Extend. So we go through and think about the questions you have to ask yourselves. We talk a little bit about the narrow windows that we have to apply this stuff in June. Our big message to our growers is this is very valuable technology, but we cannot go down the path of just adding Roundup to Dicamba, spraying it 3 or 4 times and hoping everything turns out okay. Number one, we don't have a lot of windows to make the spray applications. Number two, we don't want to create a resistant weed situation. So one of the things we did is we simply tracked some of the weather data. This is June at a weather station near West Lafayette. Green days are days when we have more than 8 hours that we can spray. Yellow days are days when we can spray, but we have less than 8 hours. And then red days are days that we can't spray. So this is based on the 2017 label. We had 184 hours based on the 17 label. If we take a look at the 2018 label with the same weather data, you go down to 2 green days, a whole bunch of yellow days, and a lot of red days. So again, you are trying to fit this spray application into a pretty narrow window. That's reality. Okay? One of the things as far as pushback that we got was some of the folks with industry weren't happy that we were using 2017 data. They said, well, 2017 was an anomaly. It was wet and windy. So we went back and looked at the previous 4 years. Here's the number of spray hours that you have at that location the previous 4 years. You have an average of 55 hours over a 5-year period. You do not have big windows of time where you can be completely on the label and spray it. So again, what you're going to be doing in a lot of cases, if you have more than 44 hours of spraying you have to do, you're going to have to roll the dice. You're going to have to decide, okay, my risk of spraying today is this. What do I have growing next to me? What do I have growing a half mile away? Okay, so I think the last thing I'm going to cover, it looks like I got about 2 minutes left. Buffers. So this whole buffer thing is kind of driving people nuts. So we went through some various scenarios with buffers. And so here's one situation here. We got a residential area. You have a field, Highway 231, 110 feet across. And you have what we call grassy ditches or vegetative shoulders. This year, based on the 2018 label, these grassy ditches are protected areas because of endangered species. In 2017, they weren't. So in this situation, the buffer for this field has to come out of the field. So if the wind is coming this direction, there's your buffer. Now, how do you manage this from an applied standpoint? You wait till the wind, you either do something different in this buffer or you wait till the wind is blowing in a different direction. So if you wait until the wind is coming from the west, you do have a housing addition here. Okay, so you can take, this can be your buffer in that situation, but you have to decide, this is this Clint Eastwood moment here. You have to decide, am I feeling lucky that day? Is this stuff going to move into that housing addition? So here's a situation here where you've got some sweet corn, 30 feet of sweet corn. Again, you've got to have another 80 feet of buffer in that field. So I'll go through just 1 or 2 more of these, and then I'll kind of be done here, Harold. So here's a situation. You've got a wooded area and an orchard. Your neighbor has Extend beans. Wind is blowing 7 miles an hour from the south to the north. Do you need a buffer? The answer is yes, you need a buffer. Buffer's right there. Why do you need a buffer here? Because if there's an off-site movement up here or over here, an inspector comes out and starts asking questions and you don't have a buffer here, he's going to check the box. So what I tell my farmers is what you're trying to do is you want that inspector to check as few boxes as possible. Chances are he's going to find some boxes to check, but if you're doing most things right by the label, you're going to get yourself in a lot less trouble. Okay? All right. My neighbor has Extend beans. Wind is blowing 8 miles an hour in that direction. Do I need a buffer? What's the answer? You guys haven't been through Dicamba training yet. Yes, you need a buffer. You always need a buffer, but you can take the buffer out of your neighbor's field. Okay? All right, I've got commercial tomatoes here. Wind is blowing 4 miles an hour. Do I need a buffer? Yes. All right, you guys don't get dessert now. You really blew it on that one. You do not need a buffer because you cannot spray. All right, trick questions. 9 miles an hour. Okay, this is a change from the 17 label. So this is a private garden type situation. Do you need a buffer? Bingo, you cannot spray. So again, last year the private stuff was not protected. This year the private stuff is protected on that label. Okay, my neighbor has corn and wheat. I have a 13 mile an hour wind blowing this way. Can I spray Fexapan? No, it's over 10 miles an hour. Last year you could spray. This year you cannot. Okay, no wind, dead calm. Can I spray now? No, good. You guys are getting back in my good graces now. Okay, now we've inserted a road here. I have a 9 mile an hour wind blowing this way. My neighbor has extend beams. Do I need a buffer? Yes. Very good. Need a buffer. Wind's coming at an angle. By the way the label reads, that's where your buffer needs to be. It's got to be on two edges of that field. Okay, this is what we usually finish off with right here. I got melons, grapes, commercial tomatoes, non-DT beans. When can I spray? Whoop, that other one came out from underneath there. So again, here I do think this is kind of the last point I want to leave you with. There's going to be some places where you ought to use something different. All right? And I think Monsanto, BASF, and DuPont would tell you that as well. You know, don't put the technology somewhere where it's going to fail for one reason or another. Okay, Harold, that's all I have. So I know I kind of went butted right up to my time there. Okay, all right, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
What was it about Arkansas that made it stand out like it did with the number of complaints?
Yeah, good question. So there's a slight difference in how they report their off-site movement. So any field that's damaged was considered a complaint. That was one issue. The second issue with Arkansas is when you look at the adoption of extend soybeans and extend cotton. So they were growing soybeans and cotton down there, and in many cases they were, whatever wasn't in extend soybean or cotton was in probably Liberty Link because they had to manage Palmer. You just had such a large percentage of a township or a county planted that, you know, when it moved off-site, it damaged everything. So I think that's, you had two things going on there, okay? So you had, number one was the number of acres planted, and I forgot what the second one was. But anyway, just a lot heavier adoption than what we had here. We only had 25% adoption here.
Kind of a river bottom down there.
Yeah, low-lying area. And keep in mind, too, that they're going to be spraying late, and it's warmer down there. So volatility has the potential to be a lot worse down there than it is up here as well. Good question. Yes, sir. Good question. Yes, the question is, am I going to need a handheld wind meter? You guys are going to do Dicamba training at some point here, right?
It's actually going on right now.
Oh, okay. Well, so I'll answer your question. So as part of the record-keeping process, every time you turn your sprayer on in a field, you have to keep a set of records. One set of records you have to keep is the wind speed and direction at boom height before you start and when you complete it. So you're either going to need to record that on some kind of a handheld device. I know Monsanto has got a phone app that will do that as well. I guess I've heard BASF is going to come out with a phone app. So you will need to record weather data. So whether that's a mechanical device or a phone app, one way or the other, you'll have to do that. Good question. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that volatility is strong or more prominent on vegetation growth. So you think we'll have much volatility issues pre-plant as a burn down? And what about corn starting from the previous year?
Yep.
Is that going to be more problematic than this year?
Okay, good question. The question is, so I told you we typically, in our volatility studies, we're seeing more volatility from plant tissue than from soil. So if I apply dicamba pre-emergence or pre-plant, pre-emergence in a burn down, will I see as many problems with volatility? The simple answer is the more dicamba that you get to the soil, the less volatility that you have. But number two, if you think about application timing, early in the year, it's cooler. All right, you're going to have less volatility early in the year because it's cooler and because you don't have nearly as much sensitive vegetation like soybeans or like some of the trees that have fully leafed out yet. So the off-target movement issues are much less with applications made in May than they are in June. So if you just look at our drift control data, we only had a handful of cases each year that were from drift to corn. And even this year, where we had all of the dicamba off-site movement, only 6% of those 87, so whatever 6% of 87 was from corn. So again, those are made earlier in the year. So you avoid a lot of problems by using the dicamba earlier. And that's what I've tried to get across to people is if we're going to make this system work, anything you can do to not have to respray multiple times in June is going to be very beneficial to minimizing off-site movement. Good question. Yes, sir. I'll get him, then I'll get you.
I can tell you in Wyandotte County, Ohio, there were more than 24 off-movement cases in one township in Wyandotte County, but they did not get reported. They didn't want to hurt the neighbors' feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good comment. So the comment is we're probably under-reporting to regulatory agencies the number of off-site movement situations that occur. In Indiana, our state chemist folks would tell you we're probably only reporting 20% or less of what actually occurs. One reason is you got neighbors working with neighbors and not wanting to be knuckleheads about it. There's also some issues related to crop insurance. So for some of these guys that lost a stand due to other reasons, if they turned in a claim related to drift or volatility, the crop insurance wasn't covering the other claim. So those were the two reasons that I heard why we weren't turning them in.
What you call bleacher beans is the twist?
Yeah, it's going to be the balanced G. Say that again.
Is there a vote for that? Would that be a lot simpler than those for that?
That's a loaded question. So the question is that the bleacher beans, I guess how good of a tool are those? So the key thing to keep in mind is that the bleacher beans, there's going to be two different varieties of that. Some of those will have glyphosate and Liberty tolerance in them, as well as the bleacher tolerance. Others may have dicamba in it as well. And so by the time that all gets itself sorted out, I mean, we'll kind of know the difference. The big concern I see with the bleacher beans is the fact that at least when you get into western Indiana and areas further west, we already have water hemp that's resistant to the herbicides that enable that technology. So given how water hemp can blow up on people, I think it's going to have a limited life cycle if that's going to be the sole tactic for water hemp control. You have Enlist out there. So Enlist is a 2,4-D technology. My guess is that if we have a whole bunch of restrictions put on Extend for 19 that we don't have on Enlist, we're not going to be able to buy enough Enlist beans. So that's what I see happening in the marketplace. Just because, again, you have two herbicides that are pretty similar in the benefits they offer. If one is a lot less restrictive and the seed is available, I could see a pretty rapid migration to that. Good question. Yes, sir.
I suppose you're living in Michigan, you're very in County, Kansas County, okay? They say from May 1st, October 1st, that's supposed to be May 2,4-D. So how did that can get cleared in there? And should you just not put a buffer around the whole county?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how that happened. Yeah, so you go into these areas where you have specialty crops, and those are areas that could be potential nightmares if you have very small spray windows, and for whatever reason you have an inversion in that spray window, or you end up having really high temperatures and getting a lot of volatility. I mean, those are areas where you really need to ask yourself, is this the best place to use this technology? So I don't know how. Well, I'll give you an example though. So, and I'm sorry, Harold, I'm done here. And when I was in Arkansas in the late 1980s, we had a 4-mile restriction for cotton fields around rice fields because of 2,4-D off-site movement. But none of the other growth regulators were restricted like that. So I think what ends up happening is the herbicide that gets the most use gets the restrictions put on it. My guess is that in your case, these dicamba restrictions may evolve to that if big problems surface in 2018. So I think your state regulatory agencies have the capability of making decisions really quickly on these additional regulations. Okay, thank you.
This thing built.